Narrated Yahya al-Matsini. A person asked Abdullah bin Zayd, who was the grandfather of Amr bin Yahya, "Can you show me how Allah's messenger used to perform ablution?" Abdullah bin Zayd replied in the affirmative and asked for water. He poured it on his hands and washed them twice. Then he rinsed his mouth thrice and washed his nose with water thrice by putting water in it and blowing it out. He washed his face thrice, and after that he washed his forearms up to the elbows twice, and then passed his wet hands over his head from its front to its back, and vice versa, beginning from the front and taking them to the back of his head, up to the nape of the neck, and then brought them to the front again from where he had started, and washed his feet up to the ankles. Narrated Amr. My father saw Amr bin Abi Hazan asking Abdullah bin Zayd about the ablution of the Prophet. Abdullah bin Zayd asked for an earthenware pot containing water, and in front of them performed ablution like that of the Prophet. He poured water from the pot over his hand, and washed his hands thrice, and then he put his hands in the pot and rinsed his mouth, and washed his nose by putting water in it, and then blowing it out with 3 handfuls of water. Again he put his hand in the water and washed his face thrice, and washed his forearms up to the elbows twice, and then put his hands in the water, and then passed them over his head by bringing them to the front and then to the rear of the head once, and then he washed his feet up to the ankles. Narrated Abu Juhayfa. Allah's messenger came to us at noon, and water for ablution was brought to him. After he had performed ablution, the remaining water was taken by the people, and they started smearing their bodies with it as a blessed thing. The Prophet offered to rakat of the Zuhr prayer, and then to rakat of the Asr prayer, while a short spear or stick was there as a sutra in front of him. Abu Musa said, the Prophet asked for a tumbler containing water and washed both his hands and face in it, and then threw a mouthful of water in the tumbler and said to both of us, Abu Musa and Bilal, drink from the tumbler and pour some of its water on your faces and chests. Narrated Ibn Shihab. Mahmud bin Arabi was the person on whose face the Prophet had ejected a mouthful of water from his family's wool while he was a boy, and Hurwa on the authority of Al-Miswar and others, who testified each other, said whenever the Prophet performed ablution, his companions were nearly fighting for the remains of the water. Narrated Asib bin Yazid. My aunt took me to the Prophet and said, O Allah's messenger, this son of my sister has got a disease in his legs. So he passed his hands on my head and prayed for Allah's blessings for me. Then he performed ablution, and I drank from the remaining water. I stood behind him and saw the sealed prophethood between his shoulders, and it was like the Zeralhijla means the button of a small tent, but some said egg of a partridge, etc. Narrated Amr bin Yahya. On the authority of his father Abdullah bin Zayd, poured water on his hands from a utensil containing water and washed them, and then, with 1 handful of water, he rinsed his mouth and cleaned his nose by putting water in it and then blowing it out. He repeated it thrice. He then washed his hands and forearms up to the elbows twice and passed wet hands over his head, both forwards and backwards, and washed his feet up to the ankles and said, This is the ablution of Allah's messenger.